High mortgage rates and increasing house prices in Australia have led to housing affordability to its worst level on record. A new report found that median income households earning around $112,000 could only afford just 14% of homes sold this year. And the issue doesn't just stop at buying homes.
New figures have highlighted our state's dire rental crisis.
Very much a landlord's market in Australia.
Thousands of rentals are set to disappear from the market.
That's leaving renters with nowhere to go as the vacancy rate.
Renting has also become a huge issue across the country, with many people struggling to find rentals, let alone deal with the soaring rental prices. So with housing affordability seemingly spiraling out of control, can the younger generation in Australia, like you and I, even afford to buy a home anymore, or let alone rent a home anymore? So today we're covering how much house you can afford to buy or rent based on your salary. And chances are it's not what you expected. So let's start off with a very fundamental rule when it comes to determining how much you should be paying for your rent. And that's the 50-30-20 rule. Basically, 50% of your take-home pay goes towards your needs like housing, food, and utilities, whilst 30% goes towards your wants like vacations, new clothes, and entertainment. And then 20% is left for your savings and investments. So if you're making $5,000 per month, then $2,500 would go towards your needs, $1,500 towards your wants, and $1,000 towards your savings for future investments. Now, the age-old rule is that your rental repayments shouldn't make up more than 30% of your needs, because this allows you to leave the other 20% for your other necessities like food and utilities. Now, I think that in today's age, we're living in a time where it's okay to have these basic guidelines. However, it's okay to be a little flexible. After all, the 30% rule was a recommendation that started all the way back in the 1970s. And a lot has changed since then, like CDs and cell phones. The median weekly rent for a house in Australia back in 2019 and 2020 was relatively stable at around about $430 per week. But after the COVID-19 pandemic, and due to rapidly rising demand, coupled with a limited supply of rental properties, the median weekly rent for houses has shot up to over $650 per week. So using our 50-30-20 budgeting rule from earlier, let's use 3 example salaries to see who can actually even afford this. John makes $60,000 per year, so he can only afford $250 per week in rent. Jenny makes the median $90,000 per year, so she can afford $367 per week in rent. And finally, Chris makes $120,000 per year, so he can afford $485 per week in rent. So even Chris, who makes well above the median salary in Australia, can't afford the median price of rent nowadays. If he were to rent out a place at $650 per week, this would make up over 40% of his take-home pay. And if we're still following the 50-30-20 rule, this only leaves him with 10% for all of his other necessities like food and utilities. If Chris wanted to keep the cost of his rent to only make up 30% of his salary, he would have to earn an extra $45,000 per year to technically be able to afford the median rent in Australia. This would mean that Chris's salary is now 80% higher than the median salary in Australia. This disparity is even worse when you consider higher cost of living capital cities like Sydney, where the median rent increases by another $100 up to $750 per week. Now, of course, like I mentioned earlier, the 50-30-20 rule isn't a one-size-fits-all. So even if the cost of your rent exceeds 30% of your take-home pay, then that's still okay to a certain extent. It just means that you have less left over for your other necessities. But this just means that you should be looking for cheaper alternatives. Premium Netflix or regular, organic free-range guacamole or regular, Woolworths or Aldi. Another great alternative to making rent fit within your budget is to split the cost of rent either with your partner or a roommate. If we assume that you split the cost of rent 50-50 with your partner or a housemate, this would mean that you'd only be paying $325 per week in rent. And in this scenario, Jenny, who makes the median salary in Australia, would be able to afford this within her budget. So the good news is that there are ways of dealing with rising rental prices in Australia such that it fits within your budget. But this is assuming that you can even secure a rental in the first place. This also means that hopefully you can continue allocating 20% of your take-home pay towards savings and investments to hopefully one day be able to afford to buy your own house. But I guess the next question is, how much house can you actually afford to purchase in Australia? Now in Australia, ultimately how much house you can afford is based on two things. Firstly, your borrowing capacity. This is pretty much how much a bank is willing to lend you to buy a home. And this is determined by several factors, including your income, existing debts, credit history, and most importantly, interest rates. In Australia, your borrowing power can vary widely depending on these different factors. On top of this, different lenders will have different criteria and risk profiles when assessing your borrowing capacity. But generally, most lenders will use your DTI or your debt to income ratio to determine how much they're going to lend you. Basically, it's a measure of how much debt you have relative to your income. So if you earn $10,000 a month, but have $9,000 in debt repayments, your DTI is 9. Which is a bit high. Ideally, you want your debt to income ratio to be below 3 or at worst between 4 to 6. The lower your DTI, the more likely your borrowing capacity will increase. This is why it's a good idea to close down any credit cards before talking with a bank. Because if you have a credit card with a $20,000 credit limit available, even though you might only be using a fraction of that limit each month, the bank will take that full $20,000 limit when determining how much you can actually borrow. The second factor that plays a big part in determining how much house you can actually afford is your house deposit. The bigger your deposit, the more negotiating power you have and choice of lenders you have available. Lenders will oftentimes even offer lower interest rates if you have a higher house deposit, since it means that the overall risk of the mortgage to the lender is lower. If you're able to put together a 20% deposit, then you'll be able to avoid what is called LMI or lender's mortgage insurance. Now, whilst it's definitely not necessary to save up for a 20% deposit, after all, sometimes it's better to get into the housing market rather than wait. But just know that a lower house deposit will come with stricter lending criteria, and most lenders will require you to pay for LMI, which will be included in your overall mortgage. Now, when it comes to searching for houses to buy or rent, most people will use websites like realestate.com or domain.com. But you should probably check out homes.com.au because they've built the next generation of property search for Australian renters, buyers, and investors leveraging AI. If you're someone who's looking to settle down in their forever home, their unique search engine allows you to do more than just search for the number of rooms, bathrooms, and car spaces. That's the old way of doing things. Instead, search by the lifestyle that you're looking for. Do you love entertaining, prefer to live near the beach, or prefer a more quiet lifestyle? Based on your lifestyle choice, homes.com.au will then find you homes that match those criteria, helping you find the right home quicker. For property investors, if you subscribe to the Buyer's Edge subscription, you can now search for properties based on the expected capital growth and rental yields as well. You no longer have to use other spreadsheets and use other research tools whilst you do your research, as everything you need as a property investor is included in this platform, making it simple and faster to find your next investment property. One of my biggest pet peeves when I was searching for property was when agents didn't list up the asking price for a property. Well, by leveraging the power of AI, homes.com.au not only provides you a price estimate for what the house should sell for, but also what it should rent out for as well. And this is all based on available data based on houses that have sold or been leased out recently in the area. Sign up for a free account today to start searching for your next rental or your forever home. And if you're a property investor, then check out their Buyer's Edge subscription to gain access to premium search functions and investor tools at just $12.95 a month. And for a limited time, when you use my code Raymond, when you sign up, you can receive 20% off every month. Links will be down in the description box. Now, when it comes to figuring out how much your mortgage repayments should ideally be, such that you can comfortably afford it and not fall into financial stress, a good framework to follow is the 28-36 rule, which means that your mortgage repayments should not be more than 28% of your monthly gross income. And second, your monthly mortgage repayments plus all your other debts should be less than 36% of your monthly gross income. Now, the reason we use gross income and not net income or take-home pay is because your take-home pay can vary drastically depending on what deductions you decide to take. For example, if my gross income is $100,000, but I decide to max out my concessional contributions, salary sacrifice for a novated lease, and other things, my take-home pay could be, let's say, $50,000. That would be the same take-home pay as someone whose gross income is $70,000 and doesn't make any deductions. So if take-home pay was used in this calculation, then that would indicate that we would both be able to afford the same house, which isn't true. Because I could always decide to not salary sacrifice into my superannuation and take home more take-home pay, whereas the other person has no wiggle room. So if we use this same framework and apply it to the same three scenarios, John can afford $1,008 each month towards his mortgage and up to $1,297 for all of his debts. Jenny can afford just under $1,500 and $1,750 for all her debts, whilst Chris can afford just under $2,000 and about $2,300 per month respectively. In terms of how much house each of those people can afford, based on those parameters, assuming a 20% deposit and a 6.8% interest rate, John can afford a $250,000 house, Jenny can afford a $350,000 house, and Chris can afford a $450,000 house. Now, the median prices of homes varies across each major capital city, with Sydney's being the highest at $1.45 million. Melbourne comes in second at just over $1 million, whilst Brisbane comes in close at about $970,000, and Perth at just over $800,000. So unfortunately, even if you have a salary of $120,000, which is above the median in Australia, you can't afford a house in any major capital city. Now, if you're perplexed as to why someone who earns above the median salary in Australia can't even afford to buy the median price of a house in Australia, well, there are a whole raft of issues that I could talk about. There's both demand and supply issues, government policies like negative gearing, stagnant wage growth, rising interest rates, foreign investments, urban planning timelines, the list goes on and on. But one factor where we can actually see the tangible impact it has is due to rising interest rates. Basically, when interest rates go up, the price of borrowing money goes up and home buyers end up paying more in interest, impacting their purchasing power. So if interest rates were at just 2.5% instead, Jenny, who earned a median salary of $90,000, can now afford a house worth $560,000 instead of a house worth $350,000. Now, unfortunately, even with a significantly higher interest rate, Jenny's borrowing power still isn't high enough where she can afford the median price of a house in any major capital city. And whilst it's definitely admirable to try and purchase a house by yourself, the reality is that for most people, it's significantly easier to purchase a house as a household with your partner. So I guess the question is, how much would your household have to be earning in order to be able to afford to purchase the median price of a house in each major capital city? Well, if we work backwards following the 2836 framework and assuming a 20% deposit with an interest rate of 6.8%, then you would need a household income of $285,000 to afford a $1.4 million house in Sydney, a $200,000 household income to afford a $1 million house in Melbourne, $190,000 to afford a house in Queensland, and $160,000 to afford a house in Perth. So it seems like as long as you have two people who earn around the median salary in Australia, you should be able to afford a house within most major capital cities, with the exception of maybe Melbourne and Sydney. But I still think that home ownership for the younger Australian generation and future generations to come is increasingly getting out of reach, if not out of reach already. They'll either have to look further out regionally if they still want to purchase a house, or look at purchasing units or apartments. If we run the same calculations as before, except this time looking at the median price of units in each major capital city, then you would need a household income of $167,000 to afford an $850,000 unit in Sydney, $130,000 to afford a unit in Melbourne, $125,000 to afford a unit in Queensland, and $120,000 to afford a unit in Perth. So a much more realistic goal to purchase a unit as a household within Australia, which unfortunately might be the reality that most households will be facing in the coming future. Now, I'm sure that in Australia, many households are currently paying more than 28% of their gross income each month towards their mortgage repayments, especially if you are someone who purchased their first house back when interest rates were really low. A lot of my friends purchased their first homes back when interest rates were at around 2%. And with their fixed rates now over, they're paying significantly more each month towards their mortgage. When it comes to affording to buy or rent in Australia, all of this is very situational. It depends on the state that you live in, your income level, how much you have saved up, your existing debts, etc. As you saw today with our 3 salary examples, a median salary of $90,000 per year is likely going to be impossible, if not very tough, without support from the bank of mum and dad or some kind of financial inheritance to be able to afford a house in Australia. Hopefully this video has helped you understand how much you can afford to basically buy or rent based on your salary. I just wanted you guys to start getting thinking about this situation. So let me know your comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and subscribe for more future content in the future. And if you want to know how to do the math to calculate whether or not you should be renting or buying, then you might want to check out this video right here.